On December 20th, 1946, inside a former girls' school in Arlington, Virginia, Meredith Gardner pulled a list of atomic scientists from a Soviet message no American was ever supposed to read. The telegram was already 2 years old. Its sentences were damaged. Its names were buried beneath numbers and cover names. But it revealed something Washington could neither ignore nor safely announce. While the United States and the Soviet Union had fought Hitler as allies, Moscow had been stealing secrets from inside America's most guarded institutions. The discovery would expose spies, redirect investigations, and reshape the history of the Cold War. Yet the evidence was so sensitive that prosecutors could not show it in court. Presidents may not have understood its full meaning, and some suspected agents were never charged. This is the Venona file, one of the most consequential entries in the modern ledger files, and the story of what happens when a democracy discovers a truth it cannot reveal. The operation began on February 1st, 1943, when the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service assigned a small team at Arlington Hall to examine Soviet diplomatic communications. American collection stations had accumulated copies of Soviet telegrams since 1939, but most remained untouched. The first objective was not a dramatic hunt for atomic spies. Analysts wanted to learn whether any of the traffic could be exploited and what it might reveal about Soviet intentions. Jean Graybill, a former school teacher recruited into Army cryptanalysis, confronted an ocean of unsorted material. Messages had to be separated by route, date, subscriber, and cryptographic system. Different channels served diplomats, trade officials, military intelligence, and the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service, then commonly called the NKVD. The traffic appeared protected by one of the strongest systems ever devised, the one-time pad. A true one-time pad depends on random numbers shared by sender and receiver. The sender combines the message with one page of those numbers. The receiver uses the matching page to reverse the process. If every page is genuinely random, kept secret, and used only once, the result is mathematically secure. There is no repeating pattern for an enemy to recover. The Soviets added another wall. Before encryption, words and phrases were converted into numerical groups with a code book. Numbers from the pad were then added to those groups. An attacker had to strip away the additive layer, reconstruct parts of an unknown codebook, recover Russian text, and then determine who was hiding behind each cover name. The mathematics did not fail. Production did. During the war, Soviet facilities manufactured duplicate pages of key material. The exact circumstances have accumulated legends involving German advances and factories under pressure. But the essential error is documented. Supposedly disposable sequences were used in more than one message. That mistake did not hand Arlington Hall a readable archive. It created small points of weakness. When two telegrams shared overlapping key material, analysts could compare them and expose relationships between the concealed texts. An impossible problem became merely brutal. In the autumn of 1943, Lieutenant Richard Halleck detected weaknesses in Soviet trade traffic. In November 1944, Cecil Phillips, Genevieve Feinstein, and Lucille Campbell made a fundamental break into a system used by Soviet intelligence. They did not yet know the identities hidden inside it, but they had opened the technical path Meredith Gardner would later follow. Gardner joined the Soviet problem after the war. He was a gifted linguist, but translation was only one part of his work. He reconstructed codebook values, inferred grammar from damaged fragments, and tested whether a possible word remained plausible across separate messages. On July 31, 1946, he extracted a phrase from a KGB telegram sent from New York to Moscow in 1944. On December 20th, another message yielded the names of leading scientists connected to the Manhattan Project. The atomic secret was not unfolding live. Gardner was reading communications already 2 years old. By the time any cable surrendered its meaning, a source might have changed jobs, broken contact, left the country, or acquired a new identity. Venona would become a weapon of counterintelligence, but never a window through which Washington could watch every Soviet operation in real time. The archive resisted almost everything thrown at it. Many translations contained long spaces labeled unrecovered. Other passages were unrecoverable because their key material had never been duplicated. Of the many thousands of intercepted messages, only about 3,000 were translated even partially. What survived was enough to reveal a hidden state inside the wartime alliance. Soviet intelligence called the American atomic program ENORMOZ, enormous. It was the designation for the project, not for a single spy. Within ENORMOZ, traffic appeared scientists, couriers, recruiters, and officers moving information toward Moscow. Klaus Fuchs, identified under the cover name Charles, had worked on the British atomic program and at Los Alamos. He passed highly valuable technical material to the Soviet Union. Theodore Hall, the youngest physicist recruited to Los Alamos, appeared as MLAD, or youngster. Other fragments illuminated the network around Harry Gold, David Greenglass, Julius Rosenberg, and associates recruited to obtain military and industrial secrets. But a cover name was not an identity. Analysts had to combine fragments: an occupation, a spouse, a journey, a friend, a meeting place, or a change of assignment. The answer might emerge only when codebreakers compared their work with employment files, interviews, surveillance, and testimony from defectors. A translation could narrow the possibilities to 3 people and still fail to prove which one had served Moscow. In September 1947, Army intelligence informed FBI liaison S. Wesley Reynolds that Arlington Hall was breaking Soviet espionage traffic. The decisive working relationship developed in October 1948, when FBI agent Robert Lamphere began coordinating directly with Gardner and the cryptanalytic team. Lamphere's task was to turn fragments into cases. The FBI compared Venona material with accounts from Elizabeth Bentley, Igor Guzenko, and Whittaker Chambers. None was treated as an infallible witness. But when a private Soviet cable matched a detail independently supplied by a defector or former courier, the possibility of coincidence began to disappear. This is where the project created its central dilemma. A decrypted cable could tell investigators where to look, yet still be too dangerous and often too incomplete to present to a jury. Revealing Venona in court could expose the Anglo-American penetration of Soviet communications. Moscow would learn which systems had been compromised, which historical traffic remained vulnerable, and how American and British analysts had succeeded. The intelligence services therefore demanded that investigators build cases from evidence that could survive public disclosure. There was also a basic legal obstacle. A damaged telegram written by an unidentified Soviet officer, translated years later and populated by cover names, was not automatically proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Intelligence could establish confidence. A criminal court required identity, authentication, context, and admissible evidence. The investigation of Klaus Fuchs showed how Venona could guide a case without appearing in it. The decrypts helped focus attention on him, but British security officers still had to interrogate him and obtain a confession. In January 1950, Fuchs admitted passing atomic information to the Soviet Union. His disclosures led investigators to courier Harry Gold. Gold's confession led to David Greenglass, and Greenglass led them toward Julius Rosenberg. Venona identified Julius first as antenna and later as liberal. The messages portray him not as a passive sympathizer trapped by Cold War hysteria, but as a productive Soviet agent who recruited sources and helped obtain information about electronics, radar, proximity fuses, aviation, and atomic work. Ethel Rosenberg's role demands more care. One decrypted message indicated that she knew of her husband's activities and had supported him, but also said she had not been recruited separately because of poor health. The surviving traffic does not depict her as an operator of Julius's importance. At trial, prosecutors relied heavily on David and Ruth Greenglass. David later recanted the famous claim that Ethel had typed espionage notes. Julius and Ethel were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage in 1951 and executed in 1953. Venona strongly confirms Julius's espionage. It does not prove that Ethel performed the same operational role, nor does it settle the moral and legal controversy surrounding her execution. Replacing the myth that no espionage existed with the claim that every defendant was equally guilty would only exchange one distortion for another. Theodore Hall represents the opposite ending. Investigators connected him to MLAD and questioned him in 1951. He denied spying. The FBI had no confession, no arrest at a clandestine meeting, and not enough independent evidence for a prosecution. Hall was never charged. The government could know with high confidence that a man had betrayed the atomic project and still be unable to prove it without exposing how that knowledge had been obtained. Venona also strengthened the case against Treasury official Harry Dexter White and became central to the historical argument over whether Ailes was State Department official Alger Hiss. The identification of ALES has been widely accepted, but remains disputed in some details. A decrypted report was powerful evidence. It was not a divine transcript immune to error. Nor did Venona justify every accusation of the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy possessed no secret master list drawn from the program. His sweeping and often reckless allegations outran the available evidence. Genuine Soviet networks and political demagoguery existed at the same time. Acknowledging one does not excuse the other. For the American public, the distinction was nearly impossible to judge. The strongest intelligence remained classified. Defendants and supporters could dismiss prosecutions as fabrication. Anti-communists could fill the silence with rumor. Officials sometimes knew more than they could explain, while citizens were expected to trust conclusions without seeing what stood behind them. Even the question of what President Harry Truman knew remains uncertain. The record does not support a cinematic scene in which he receives a complete folder naming every traitor and simply orders that they remain free. He may not have been briefed directly on Venona, or may not have understood its full significance. His public dismissal of several espionage allegations is difficult to reconcile with complete knowledge. Here, uncertainty is the honest conclusion. But Moscow did learn that American codebreakers were inside its old traffic. William Weisband, a Russian linguist working within the American Signals Intelligence System, was himself a Soviet agent. He informed Moscow about American cryptanalytic progress. Later, the breach moved even closer to the investigations Venona was generating. From 1949 to 1951, British intelligence officer Kim Philby served in Washington as liaison to American services. His official position gave him access to Arlington Hall and summaries of Venona material. His secret loyalty belonged to Moscow. That access was devastating. The cables were old, but the investigations were current. If Soviet intelligence learned which cover names were being pursued, it could warn endangered agents, alter contact procedures, or help a source disappear. Venona clues helped direct suspicion toward British diplomat Donald Maclean, concealed in the traffic as Homer. Before British investigators could confront him, Maclean fled in May 1951 with Guy Burgess. Suspicion tightened around Philby. He survived another 12 years before defecting to Moscow in 1963. Philby could compromise investigations, but he could not erase the archive. The messages had already been transmitted, intercepted, and stored. Nor does the chronology support the claim that Moscow deliberately continued reusing vulnerable paths in order to protect him. Most of the productive traffic predated his regular Washington access by years. The archive remained fixed while the knowledge surrounding it grew. New biographical evidence could unlock an old cover name. A confession could illuminate a previously obscure passage. Improved methods could recover another fragment from a telegram that had resisted analysts for decades. The CIA was officially briefed on Venona in 1953 and began assisting with counterintelligence work. British and other allied services contributed. Hundreds of first-time translations were produced between 1960 and 1980, long after the spies discussed in them had vanished from their original positions. On October 1st, 1980, the program ended. The public remained outside the secret for another 15 years. In 1995, the National Security Agency began releasing Venona translations in 6 waves. Historians could finally compare decades of courtroom argument, political accusation, and denial with the communications investigators had used in silence. The release changed Cold War history, but it did not create a perfect map of Soviet espionage. Passages remained unreadable. Some cover names remained unidentified. Most important, a decrypted cable recorded what a Soviet officer reported. An intelligence service could misunderstand a source, exaggerate an achievement, or pass along a false claim. Venona is powerful because these were private operational communications never intended for American eyes, and because many details converge with independent evidence. It is not sacred text. Its achievement belonged to people who spent years in a classified world without public recognition. Jean Graybiel, organizing mountains of traffic. Richard Hallock, finding the first weakness. Cecil Phillips, Genevieve Feinstein, and Lucille Campbell opening the KGB system. Meredith Gardner, rebuilding language from numerical ruins. Robert Lamphere, converting fragments into investigations. And analysts who continued searching long after the famous cases had closed. They broke enough of an unbreakable cipher to expose a vast espionage campaign. What they could not break was the political paradox created by their success. A democracy must sometimes conceal how it knows. Reveal the method too early, and an adversary escapes. Protect it too long, and the public cannot judge the evidence. Defendants cannot challenge the state's strongest claims, and secrecy begins protecting institutions as much as it protects the country. So where should the line have been drawn? Should Venona have remained hidden to preserve the capability? Or should more of its evidence have been exposed in the name of justice? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to the Modern Ledger Files, then continue to our next Cold War case, because governments can seal an archive for decades, but eventually, every secret leaves an entry in the ledger.